Absolutely delighted to be with you all today. Just a couple of observations as we begin. I think most everybody who's on today realizes that the Alliance for Market Solutions works in the energy and climate space, particularly on carbon tax issues. As we've been in this effort for 5 years, we've seen evolutions in the politics of climate as an issue. Most recently, we think the ruling in West Virginia versus EPA is a real ground-changing ruling from the Supreme Court. And regardless of what anyone says the executive branch can or cannot do in the aftermath of West Virginia versus EPA, we think it's going to take at least a decade to sort that out as different rulemakings go forward and get challenged in the courts. As a result, the ball for climate policy is in Congress's court for the foreseeable future. And as we look out over the next couple of years, the single opportunity to address climate in the foreseeable future is the reconciliation bill pending in the Senate right now. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the outlook for that reconciliation legislation. So this morning we called together four of really the insiders when it comes to reconciliation legislation. Bill Hoagland, who I believe has written more reconciliation bills than anybody else in the world. Maya McGinnis, who's been working at the nexus of the politics, reconciliation and fiscal issues at the Committee for a Responsible Budget for years. Neil Chatterjee, who I have forgot this until I actually worked on tax policy at the Ways and Means Committee early in his career, and then for the Senate Majority Leader, and then the FERC chairman, really an expert on the politics, both of legislation and of energy and climate policy. And Brandon Pizzola from the macroeconomics team at EY. For anybody who really wants to understand the fiscal and macroeconomic results of tax policy, Brandon is one of the people that you turn to. So this morning, what I thought I'd do is just open it up for comments from each of the panelists. Since Maya and Brandon are on, why don't we start with Maya? Just general observations, Maya, about where we are in reconciliation. We hear lots of speculation. I read in one of the trade rags this morning that text may actually have been sent on some provisions to the parliamentarian to begin the birdbath rule. That is, on the one hand, encouraging for those interested in reconciliation. On the other hand, it's kind of interesting that this might be the first language to go to the parliamentarian to go through the birdbath process. So Maya, can I just start with you, open it up? The floor is yours, your observations and thought in this critical month for reconciliation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alex. Sure. So, I mean, I think, and boy, does anybody think that they can predict anything these days? Certainly I don't, but I do think that a lot of the signs, both the quiet ones and the ones we're reading in the press, are that reconciliation is moving along steadily in a much more optimistic way for people who think that what they're thinking about than people were thinking a few weeks and certainly a few months ago when things got ugly and then things got quiet. So just to put out kind of the parameters of what it appears that will be talked about, it's a policy where two of our favorite topics obviously are going to be central to it, both the fiscal policy and the climate policy. And so assuming that what we're hearing is accurate, which I think it is, I think we are looking at a package that would focus on revenues, and importantly, revenues that are policies in their own right. But so revenues that would generate a significant amount of money, say $1 trillion. I could see the potential for $2 trillion, but it sounds like $1 trillion is more likely. And that about half of that would have to be set aside for deficit reduction, and the other half would be there available for policies. And as we know, the policies are likely to be those climate pieces. The last package that was being considered was about $550 billion. So I think there are incredibly compelling reasons to have fiscal and climate together. I just want to mention this because I've always been interested in how similar they are as issues, because both of them present these huge, huge threats to the economy and the globe. In the case, well, actually, both of them are global, but in terms of the damage that they can do, but their effects are gradual. And so you don't see them or feel them happening in the immediate, and there's no action forcing moments. And in fact, there have been cottage industries that have popped up all over the place opposing progress on both of those topics. So the elegance of combining them together is incredibly appealing. And so I think we'll talk more about this, but I think where we are is that I would put the odds certainly as greater than 50-50 that we are going to see a reconciliation package that does get done That's a lot of optimism for things these days. And I think it is certainly worth discussing how a carbon tax could or should play a role in that, particularly if it hits bumps along the way, because we know one thing, it's that there won't be smooth riding the entire time from here on out. And finally, the timeline, this has to get done in the next few weeks. They don't have a long runway to get this done. So we'll really know by the end of July, I think, whether this has legs or not.
Maya, why do you think that reconciliation fell out of favor but is now in favor? Why do you think there's greater than a 50% chance? Is it the substance of the deal? Is it the healthcare drivers? Is it the political environment? I'm interested in you identifying what the drivers are that you think will push it across the finish line, since we all need to pay attention to how those will change over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people will all have their different storylines for what they think happened. I think I've sort of seen it enough to have a pretty good sense that when Senator Manchin said some of the things that mattered to him, he was being very clear and very direct about what those things were. And the first reconciliation bill that was being contemplated was much larger than it was billed at. And the reason is because there were all of these kind of fake or gimmicky expiring provisions that were included in this. This was a huge multi-trillion, $5-6 trillion package that they wanted to make appear look smaller. So they put a lot of policies in with fake expirations. This is not the first time we've seen this, probably nor is it the last. We've seen this with tax cuts all the time. We'll be dealing with the expiring Trump tax cuts soon. But when there's a limit, this is kind of the most common gimmick where you put in expirations. And Senator Manchin had been very clear that he did not want to do that, and that he thought the package that was being considered was too large. And there's all sorts of storylines about what happened out there. But one thing I have seen is that when he says he has some principles he wants to have honored in these packages, he's very clear and he means it. So at the same time, what he's also said is he is good with smart revenues, focusing mainly on progressive taxes, repealing some of the things that happened in the Trump tax cuts or ways to increase individual and corporate taxes. He is good with a number of the climate provisions, the details of which still have to be figured out. He is insisting that half the revenue be used for deficit reduction, something that I will gladly make the case for, given that we are at near record debt levels and highest levels of inflation in 40 years. And he was the one who was out in front, sort of in the policy community. We were talking about it. Larry Summers was clearly talking about it, the risks of inflation. But Senator Manchin was talking about the risks of inflation too early on. And certainly it's proven that he was correct. And so he wants a package that would help inflation, not harm inflation. I think it's important that anything that succeeds is structured to achieve that.
Neil, can we turn to you? And welcome. Good to have you here. Can you follow on Maya's comments about the general state of the political situation around reconciliation? What's your thought on the outlook, and what do you think some of the most important drivers are right now?
I still think it's tricky. They're running out of time. That said, having spent a considerable number of years in the U.S. Senate, I know when the Senate wants to act and have the votes, they can get things done. And so there's some people who are speculating that if things aren't wrapped up, or if there isn't some at least initial movement on a package, perhaps centered around the ACA subsidies, at least before the Senate breaks for August, that it'll be too little too late. I count myself in a latter camp, having seen the Senate. I think if on September 29th, something were to come together, I think the Senate could still try to act. I understand why Senator Manchin is at the table right now. He's got considerable leverage. I appreciated his efforts to try to, put together a bipartisan package on energy policy issues. He was unable to land that, but I think a lot of the provisions that would be included in theoretically the draft reconciliation were some of those items that were on the table in the bipartisan negotiation. I think there's certainly provisions in the energy title that a lot of Republicans would support, if not for the underlying partisan vehicle that is the budget reconciliation process. But getting it done is still going to be tricky. You gotta pay for it. Senator Manchin has insisted upon that. I'm not familiar enough with the internal negotiations, but my understanding is that he and Senator Sinema are not on the same page in terms of how to finance the package. That she has expressed opposition to paring back some of the Trump era corporate tax cuts. She's more in favor of this book minimum tax approach, which to my understanding, Senator Manchin is not yet on board with. And then there's also a lot of complexities within the underlying provisions. I know that Senator Manchin has drawn a line in the sand on direct pay, which not only will take a hit on some of the solar credits, for instance, but could also have an impact on 45Q, which is something that I think Senator Manchin has very much touted as important to him in getting the $85 45Q through this done. And without direct pay, I'm not certain that provision works as well. And so I think there might need to be some efforts to maybe carve out 45Q, or I'm not certain how you can make it work. So still a lot of details that need to be fleshed out. But if you're Senator Manchin, you've got the pen at 50 votes, and I think he is in a position to try and move forward the package that he wants. But then it's a question of getting through the House. What do you do with SALT? I don't know that Senator Manchin has stated affirmatively that he is in favor of spending $220 billion on the ACA subsidies. I think he's been rather vague about that, at least in the public commentary that I've seen. And there's other variables at play. I think there's this assumption that if the Senate can get 50 votes for something and get it out, that the House will take a quarter loaf. And I think that's based on how Washington used to work. I'm not certain that that's the case anymore. I think you've got a lot of frontline Democrats who are going into a tough election cycle who may need certain things that might not be included in that package. And then I think you've got some progressives that had their expectations in a very, very different place at the start of this process when they were looking at a $6 trillion package that was going to transform the U.S. economy, that may say this isn't sufficient and we want more. There's the prospect of another, 2023 reconciliation hanging out there. So there's all of these different, threads and variables. So 50-50. I tend to be, you talk to some people on the Hill, some of my Republican friends say no chance, it's dead, 1%, 2%. You have others who, are with Maya closer to 50. I tend to be closer where Maya is, just because I do think the political will is there. And it's just a matter of finalizing the details amongst the 50 Senate Democrats. And I just seem to think that they'll probably be able to get there. It won't be pretty. Who knows what the final package will look like, but I think they'll probably get there. One other element to timing on this, because no Republican will support this package, you need all 50 Democrats physically present and there. And with Senator Leahy undergoing surgery, unclear what his timetable for return will be, and he's got to be there, and he's got to be there through the Vote-A-Rama, which is going to be a lot of votes and time consuming, and so that's a factor as well. Is you got to have 50 votes physically present to move this forward in the Senate.
So fast, so many factors, Neil, you just went through, but you've been there in the small rooms when the Senate has been putting together a package that then has to pass the House. I have thought that the climate provisions could drag that package through the House, but now with the word being that the climate provisions are being scaled back, I'm increasingly thinking that the Affordable Care Act subsidies will be very important for appealing to progressives in the House. Can you walk us through, as somebody who's been in those rooms, how does that calculation get made? At some point, do the Democratic leadership of the House and the Senate have to sit down and say, this is the deal we can pass the Senate? Can you pass it in the House, Speaker Pelosi? That has to happen. And does that happen before they put the deal together with Senator Manchin? Or does that happen after there's a deal, they're committed, and there's this moment of where they have to do a reality check with the House? Just what should we be thinking about when that rather remarkable conversation has to occur?
Yeah, it's interesting. So from my vantage point, I left, I got confirmed by the Senate in August of 2017. So I spent very little time in an environment in which we have the Senate majority, the House majority, and the White House. The bulk of my tenure in the Senate, we were either in the minority or we found ourselves in a situation from 2010 to 2014 where Senator McConnell was able to leverage the House majority to negotiate from the Senate minority with Senator Reid and with the Obama administration. And then from 2015 to 2017, we had the Senate majority and the House majority, and we're negotiating with the administration. And what was interesting there is we did have to make that calculus constantly, particularly during the years that Speaker Boehner was governing the House majority. We were in constant communication with the speaker's office at the staff level, at the principal level, because we had to understand what he could get through the House. And we didn't want to put ourselves in a position where Senator McConnell had his members taking a vote on something that the Obama administration could sign off on that could not get through the House. He didn't want to put his members in that position. He didn't want to put Speaker Boehner in that position. And so it required constant communication. And so this is a similar, albeit, different dynamics to where you have, one individual in Senator Manchin who is driving the negotiation. But I would assume that Senator Schumer is constantly keeping Speaker Pelosi apprised of what that conversation is. And Speaker Pelosi's got a pretty good feel for the pulse of her caucus. And I have to imagine that she is relaying back to Schumer what her caucus can or cannot take. But we may be at a point right now where the House in particular is in the, if you build it, they will come state, where they just got to hope that the Senate can get something out, put it on the floor, and see if the speaker can muscle the votes. She can, and I think she likely will have to offer her frontline members an opportunity to vote on SALT in some form or fashion, and some of the other, politically sensitive votes, to give them cover to maybe ultimately swallow what the Senate can pass. And that's part of this back and forth, right? So I assume, again, I'm not privy to these internal deliberations, but my gut instinct based on my experience is that the speaker is running through the calculus. She's got a general sense of what is on the table and then might be able to get 50 votes and get out of the Senate. She knows where her challenges are going to be in getting that package through the House, and is going to try and manufacture ways to provide cover to her members, both her frontline Democratic moderates who are worried about things like SALT, and progressives who may not be enthralled with everything that's in this package. She's got to find different ways to ameliorate those wings of her conference. That could be promising another reconciliation to progressives and coming up with a vote on SALT with some maybe commitment to try and do SALT, in an end of year vehicle or some other manner. Unclear, but yeah, I mean, you've constantly got to check your flanks in the House and I'm certain those communications are happening and that strategic thinking is taking place.
Okay. Brandon, I want to turn to you. So Maya estimated revenue of $1 to $2 trillion, most likely at one, but let's just use the $1 to $2 trillion range, with half of that going to deficit reduction. We've seen those sort of intimations out of Senator Manchin. We are approaching a recession, or we may be in a recession already. As you think about just the revenue side of reconciliation, what should we be thinking about the economic impacts of additional federal revenue coming through this reconciliation bill? Like when you think about increased corporate taxes or consumption taxes or other things, what do you think the long-term impact of those will be? Because I'm very interested in the way Senators Manchin and Sinema and others will be thinking about, on the one hand, they're going to be looking at a major tax increase. They want to be able to justify that. Economy may be the number one issue coming into the election. How should they be thinking about the revenue side of whatever they're going to be looking at?
Gotcha. So I'll answer first somewhat conceptually, just how to think about this, and then a bit more nitty gritty. So from a conceptual perspective, the way economists tend to think about taxes, if you just kind of bucket them in high level categories, is you can think of them as generally capital taxes versus labor taxes versus consumption taxes. There are other taxes, but generally speaking, those are the general buckets. Generally speaking, capital taxes are the least efficient in terms of raising revenue, which is to say, if you're trying to raise $100 of revenue, you have the biggest negative impact on GDP from a capital tax and the least from a consumption tax. So that's the general framework. Thinking about that in this context, it's worth thinking about what types of revenue raisers have been brought up over the last, I don't know, maybe year or so with Build Back Better, just thinking what potential revenue raisers could go in there. A number of them have been capital taxes, whether it's changes to the corporate income tax rate or changes to GILTI. There's been a number of changes, proposed changes in the international tax space. It's probably worth contrasting that, given what this forum is, to a carbon price. Just how does what has been proposed, how does it compare to a carbon price? Carbon price being either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, just kind of a holistic term for that. And it's worth noting a carbon price can raise quite a lot of revenue. Over the last 2-3 years, there's been more than a dozen bills introduced into Congress. So it's some sort of carbon price, a carbon tax or cap and trade system. They've ranged anywhere from about $15 a ton to maybe about $60 a ton. Even if you have a relatively modest carbon price, say $25 a ton, that gets you to $1 trillion over the budget window. So a carbon price, even a relatively modest one, both in kind of what's needed to address climate change and also what's been introduced, can raise quite a lot of revenue. And it's worth noting, we've done some recent simulations with our macroeconomic model comparing what's raised money with a corporate income tax rate increase, which is say increase to 25%. We'll call it a business tax or a capital tax. You can kind of think of the corporate income tax illustrative capital tax increase and compare it to a carbon price that raises the exact same amount of revenue. It's kind of saying you need to raise some amount of revenue. What's raised the corporate income tax at 25%. That raises the same amount of money as about a $12 per ton carbon tax. And generally speaking, we estimate that the corporate income tax rate increase will decrease the US economy by about $40 billion a year, whereas the carbon tax is actually like a near zero impact. And that modeling, one of the caveats that people will be thinking about is you raise money, you have to do something with that money. We assume half the spending's on productivity enhancing infrastructure, which offsets some of the impacts. So that's how we get to a near zero impact from the carbon tax relative to the $40 billion per year impact with the corporate tax.
Alex, could I jump in and then, or at the appropriate time?
You can add, I'll bet your question's smarter than mine, so go ahead.
Well, I thought your question was really important, and we're in this terrible moment where we may already be in a recession, and we're certainly already in high inflation. And the irony or the trick of all of this, of course, is that all of the policies that would help one tend to harm the other, right? And so when you're thinking about revenues, raising revenues is bad for being in a recession and good for countering inflation. And then if you go one level deeper, you kind of have to think about which revenues. And this is where the tough part is that when inflation's going on, what you actually want to do is figure out how to get individuals to spend less and save more. But at the same time, things are costing them more. And so you want to help them cover the cost of buying what they need to. So raising taxes on people on the lower end of the spectrum would actually be the thing that would most help inflation. Let me be really clear. I am not recommending that. That would also be a wrong-headed policy to do in a time when people are really suffering. But when you think about the different effects of who you're taxing, it does make a difference. So if we're looking at taxes on high-income people, that's not going to help with inflation as much, but it's not going to harm with the recession as much. So I'm just trying to put out there that there is this difficult tension. It's the same tension the Fed is dealing with, which is balancing these two things, which is why one never wants to get in the position of high inflation and a recession, and we're stuck in a tough spot.
And it's worth noting, if you don't mind me jumping in, who pays the tax in the context of a carbon tax. A carbon tax you can kind of generally think of as a consumption tax on carbon intensive goods, which is why I bring up the capital tax, consumption tax distinction. Even though consumption taxes generally are regressive and the carbon tax also is regressive, it's worth thinking what that means. It means lower income folks have a higher percent change in their income, but on net, overall, they have a lower share of all of income. And so on a carbon tax, only about, depending on the estimate, 10 to 25% of all revenue raised from a carbon tax comes from the bottom 40% of households. So putting that in context, a 25% corporate income tax rate raises the same amount of revenue as a $12 per ton carbon tax, which raises actually the same amount of revenue as a $15 per ton carbon tax, where you exclude the bottom 40% of households. So if the issue, if there's concern about regressivity and a carbon tax, it's really easy to pull out say the bottom 40% of households and still raise quite a lot of revenue.
And so Brandon, tell me what happened. Tell me about, compare that, the regressivity to an increase in the corporate rate or any tax on capital. Which is more regressive, a consumption tax or an increase in the capital tax?
So that's going to be the big tension with the capital tax, consumption tax distinction. What I talked about before was the relative impact on GDP, and consumption tax is always going to be more efficient there. Capital taxes are kind of the flip. They have the bigger impact on GDP, but they also tend to be much more progressive. They tend to tax much higher income folks. And so when you think about a carbon tax, that's when you start to have to think about what parts of the income spectrum do I pull out? Because you could, for example, take a carbon tax, which will be much more regressive than a corporate income tax increase, and then pull out some segment of the population, whether that's done with, say, rebate checks to them, or it's done with changes in other programs to help low-income folks. You can kind of pick and choose there, but it's worth noting, even when you start pulling out big segment of the tax base, a carbon tax is still much more efficient than a corporate income tax rate increase in terms of the GDP impact.
Okay. Hey, Neil, can I turn to you for a second? And then in just a moment, Meredith is keeping track of anybody who has questions. So if anybody who's watching has questions, raise your hand on the way that you do that on Zoom, and Meredith will queue you up and we'll start asking questions from the audience. But Neil, let me ask you, we talk about carbon tax because we're interested in climate policy, and we're talking about reconciliation as not just the only tax vehicle out there, but really the only major energy and climate policy vehicle that we see for some period of time. What are your thoughts on where we are on climate policy, given you're very aware of the science? During your tenure at FERC, you were very aware of the politics and the transitions that are occurring in the marketplace. Where do you think energy and industrial companies are versus the politics as they look out over the next several years? I'm just generally, where are we in time when it comes to energy and climate policy? Do we need to be focusing on this reconciliation package, or are there other things? Just generally, what are you thinking about this space right now?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I don't think there are 50 votes to include a price on carbon in the reconciliation package. So I think it's not going to happen in this manner. And I actually don't want it to, for this very reason. It is an inherently partisan vehicle that is being used on reconciliation. And I want Republicans to be able to support a price on carbon. And I think that my concern is, if the price on carbon were included in this vehicle, you may have some folks who otherwise down the road may be supportive, who have to criticize it because it's part of an inherently partisan package, and I don't want that. But to answer, your larger, more significant question is where we are in this space and policy. Look, I had a front row seat to the energy transition when I was at FERC, and I was quite fortunate to have that. And I saw in a lot of ways, what were effective policies and what weren't. And I came to the conclusion in wrestling with some of these challenges of balancing state policies versus efficient functioning federal markets, in trying to square the impact that subsidies and mandates and regulations had on markets. But in doing so, having people, threaten to pull out of markets, it was a real tightrope throughout. And what I came to find is that when it comes to carbon mitigation, a transparent price on carbon is a vastly superior tool to some of these other mechanisms. And what you found is, you have certain interests, and particularly now at a time when Americans are suffering from inflationary pressure and high energy costs, it's hard to talk about, increasing energy costs. And I recognize that from a political standpoint. But I think we have to look at the other costs. What are the costs of regulations and subsidies and mandates, and how, when you juxtapose those costs to a price on carbon, I think you'll find that a price on carbon is a better deal for consumers and for the economy, as opposed to some of these other decarbonization tools. And I think industry recognizes that. I think folks, are cognizant of the need to mitigate emissions, to facilitate the energy transition, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't compromise reliability and affordability. And I think one of the things that we're seeing on the power side is, look, I think the grid is going to be tested this summer. And part of the reason for that is that the decisions around the generation mix have been made by political actors, not by engineers. And what is happening is, in certain regions, you've got resources that are necessary to maintain reliability that are being prematurely retired before their replacements are ready to go, before the balancing resources are in place. And I think that if you had instead allowed engineers and economists to make these decisions based around decarbonization goals anchored around a price on carbon, you could transition the economy in a way that doesn't sacrifice reliability or affordability and cause these scenarios. And I think, look, there is a broad group of folks who are willing to have this conversation. And again, I think if the likelihood of what is going to transpire this November delivers divided government from 23 to 25, there could be an opening to have a conversation amongst folks on both sides of the aisle about smart policies to decarbonize and to incentivize a transition to a cleaner energy future. I hope I'm not being naive about that. I tend to be an optimist in this space. I think my own journey in really delving into energy policy and seeing what worked and what didn't, has brought me to this place. I think the business case for clean energy as it continues to improve is something that Republicans can embrace. And I'm hopeful that we can have that conversation going forward on a bipartisan basis, which is coming back to my core initial point. That's why I don't want conversation around a price on carbon to be thrust into this partisan reconciliation exercise. I'd rather be able to continue to engage with Republicans in both the House and the Senate, as well as at the state level, about the justification for these policies. Again, not in a vacuum. We're comparing these policies to other things. My final point on this, I think there are folks on the political left who have sort of moved away from the idea of a price on carbon. It's interesting. You've got groups like API in the chamber contemplating a price on carbon, the Business Roundtable, but you've got groups on the left that were moving away because they didn't think a price on carbon would accelerate the transition fast enough and preferred more of a regulatory approach. I think what the Supreme Court did last week in the West Virginia versus EPA case will have broader ramifications beyond EPA's ability to regulate carbon emissions. I think this introduction of the major questions doctrine, we'll have to see how it plays out. It could have an impact on other agencies' ability to regulate carbon, which really pushes the conversation around carbon mitigation back to Congress, where, in my view, is where it should be. And I hope that provides us the opening to have a responsible conversation about what the best tools to decarbonize are. I have long said I prefer market-based solutions to regulatory ones, and I think it's time to have that conversation.
Neil, I appreciate your optimism. I declare that my cup is half full every morning. Whether one would agree by observing it or not, I simply declare that to be the case. And I agree it would be ideal, and you can discuss an upside to Democrats and Republicans working together in a divided government next year on durable climate policy. Right? That's the ideal. I'm concerned that the differences on fiscal agenda and climate are still too far apart, too far for that bridge to come together in the foreseeable future. I'm interested in your thoughts on that. First, though, I do want to get a question in from the audience. Adam Jackson has asked a question to you, Neil, in particular. You mentioned that the clean energy transition for the grid should be in the hands of engineers, not bureaucrats. How can a probable, in parentheses, Republican Congress act to make that happen? How do we get to what, on many fronts, how do we get to what you just outlined?
Yeah, I think we're having increasingly a conversation about reliability, and I think that is a good thing. I think in our, push to decarbonize the past few years, we have taken our eyes off of reliability. And I view that as an opening to go to Republicans, to go to folks like Senator Manchin, who has expressed an interest and concerns about reliability, and start to have a conversation about the energy transition in a more balanced way. I think what has happened is you have certain segments within the administration and with Congress who want to skip the transition part of the energy transition. And I think that with divided government, with a potential Republican-controlled House, look, some people may not think it was a big revelatory thing, but I think the fact that Leader McCarthy enabled this group of conservative climate leaders in the Republican caucus to put out, a policy statement is significant. You would not have seen that even half a decade ago in either chamber, in either Republican caucus. And so I do think there are Republicans who are willing to have a conversation going forward about the clean energy transition. Now, they may not call it climate change, they may not call it, carbon mitigation, but they're going to be pushing policies around innovation and incentivizing technology, and with a focus on reliability that I think could be an opening to have that conversation. And then, there are other policies that are being contemplated as well. You've got Republicans in both chambers talking about, a border carbon adjustment and starting to leverage America's carbon advantage over our adversaries. And I think that could play a role as well. And you could see growing support for approaches like that.
All right, let me turn and ask sort of a similarly themed question to you, Maya. How do you see the next Congress working on fiscal issues if Republicans take over one or two bodies of the Congress and they're working with President Biden in the White House? To me, what's fascinating is that this reconciliation bill that we're considering right now has the potential to see a convergence between climate and fiscal issues, which are my two North Stars that I care a great deal about. If this doesn't happen this year, what do you think about the next couple of years on the fiscal front?
Well, unlike the two of you, I wake up every morning and my cup is completely empty. And it's just like, oh my God, how are we going to bust through this terrible, terrible, terrible political environment with all these really urgent issues that we need to deal with? That is why I love the elegance pairing of fiscal and climate. That is why I'm hopeful that even though the opportunities in this moment aren't huge, they exist, which is unusual. But listen, I think we're going to have divided government, and I think it's going to be brutal, because I think the playbook that we've seen here is members of, with Obama, when Mitch McConnell said we are not going to let them have any wins. And I think Democrats are going to understand that that playbook has been used before and use it in their own ways. And I think the tendency to compromise is being lost as we speak, and that concerns me greatly. Where I do see the opportunities are, it's not really an opportunity, but if there's a crisis, and there certainly could be, and feels like there's likely there will be, but certainly one on the fiscal front, or kinds of things that you can remind the natural disasters that are going on. If we have some things that are ready to go, if there is a huge problem in the economy or some other kind of crisis, so that our response is smart instead of stupid. And often our response in a moment like this is stupid, where both parties take all the things they want to do, wrap them up as a response to emergency, combine them, augment them into a two sort of doubly large budget busting Christmas tree of a response. That's how we often respond. Though I think in COVID, we did a pretty good job until the last bill. But if instead we have a blueprint of kind of ways to respond to different types of crises, I think that is an opportunity that we should invest in being ready for, because I think there's some moment there. And I think that groups are trying to work together are springing up. On the fiscal front, there's a great group in the House, 30 and 30, that's run by Jody Arrington of Texas and Scott Peters from California, and I work very closely with them. That's focusing a great deal on what to do about fiscal policy. This group came out of COVID where they said, we have to borrow now, and we have to borrow a lot, but as soon as we are through this moment, we have to deal with our national debt, and they're working on that. So that's the kind of cooperation that I think is important. The other opportunity that I think is there is, oddly enough, the old third rail, Social Security, seems to be less of a third rail than it used to be, just because everything's a third rail now. And I think there is a really helpful process opportunity out there, which is the Trust Act, which is bipartisan, bicameral. It's Manchin and Romney who created it. And it basically says, if there's a trust fund, Social Security, Medicare, highway, disability, whatever it is, that is going to be insolvent within 15 years, you have to put together a special committee that will try to fix it. Like, how can you object to that? I don't know. Who can say, nope, we know that our important programs are headed toward insolvency and we will not try to fix it. That said, the AARP opposes this. And that's sort of, to me, often these days, a sign of it's probably good policy if the AARP is out there fighting against it, because how could they possibly say we shouldn't try to save these programs? But what I like about this is it is a process that is relatively easy. And it doesn't stack the deck towards any kind of solution. It could be taxes, it could be spending, it could be anything. And the third thing I'll say is there is a debt ceiling increase that has to be addressed after the midterms, maybe a full year after, but maybe much sooner. That is a moment that in the past years has been a really stupid moment, where we've increased the debt ceiling as you have to, without any of the kinds of antics and discussion about default. But we've done it while also passing policy that increased the debt, which is just kind of doubling down on the fiscal irresponsibility. What we should do is increase the debt ceiling and have something that goes along with that on a parallel track that will put in place policies to decrease the debt. That's where I think, again, if we don't get all the things that ideally we could in reconciliation, you start to put together a package that's ready to go. That could have the Trust Act, that could have something on carbon, that could have a debt commission or something else. And I think being prepared for those moments is the greatest way to take advantage of what could either be a crisis or is kind of the action forcing moments that we know are built into the budget. But I should just end where my cup is back to empty. Like, how badly polarized we are right now is terrifying. We are not responding to massive emergencies that are going on in our country and around the world because we are so focused on fighting. And the two parties are so entrenched and constantly tell themselves the lie of a story, which is as soon as we have the majority, we will do all the good things we promised to do. And then it doesn't happen. And I think if we don't address the deep polarization in our country right now and the divides and all this being exacerbated by disinformation and other things that are just throwing more onto the fire, we will fail to take advantage of any of these opportunities or even emergencies as we obviously need to, and I hope we will. Alex, you're on mute.
Thank you. I'm going to follow on that with my cup is empty scenario. And then I'm going to ask Neil to comment on it. And then Neil, I understand you've got to hop off at 11:50. So I want to give you just a couple of minutes. I am very worried that if we fail to turn the corner and start doing deficit reduction, which is one of the potentials in this reconciliation package, and we fail to put in place responsible climate policies, at some point towards the end of this decade, the manifestation of climate change, rising sea level, increased fires, these sorts of issues force us to act on climate through inefficient regulations. And at the same time, our fiscal condition forces us to act by raising taxes on earnings and income. And that both of those drivers are, because of the severity of the problem, are at a magnitude that can really bend the curve on our long-term economic outlook. And we can drive ourselves into a really dire economic situation over the long term as we try to deal with sort of our current problems. If by failing to act on them until they are true crises, we can have this multiplication, this layering on effect of an increased regulatory burden and increased taxes on capital that sort of have this literally a compounding effect driving down economic growth. And so for me, the opportunity to do something in the near term that is responsible from both a climate perspective and a fiscal perspective is an imperative. And that's if I allowed myself to have my cup half empty or half full or zero, completely empty, that's what I would worry about. Before you respond, Mike, quickly.
One sentence, which is the single best thing we can do to alleviate these tensions is have a growing economy. And what you just painted means the opposite.
Yeah. Neil, you want closing comments from you?
Yeah, look, I think, when it comes to climate policy, when it comes to the clean energy transition, consumers are going to drive a lot of this. And that is what, supports my optimism on this, is that increasingly as consumers become more aware of their energy consumption and their carbon footprint, everyone from Fortune 50 companies to small businesses to individual households are clamoring for cleaner sources of energy. And I think as the business case for clean energy continues to improve, I do believe that market forces will enable us to avoid the scenario that you're painting, Alex. I also think that innovation is going to come into play. I do believe ultimately long duration storage plus solar could be a brilliant solution that enables us to reach our decarbonization goals without sacrificing reliability and affordability. We need that innovative breakthrough in the storage space. I do believe it will come. It hasn't yet, but it will come. And I think, we need to continue to ensure that our markets are incentivizing, this type of innovation to move us in that regard. And so, look, we have been successfully squeezing carbon out of the U.S. power sector for some time, and we have done so in the absence of cap and trade legislation moving forward, in the absence of the EPA Clean Power Plan moving forward. With President Trump pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accords, we still continue to drive carbon emissions out of the U.S. power sector because the markets we're facilitating that outcome. And so I do not share your doom and gloom, because I do think the business case for clean energy is only going to get better and better and better. And you combine that with consumer demand, and I think that that will lead us to a cleaner future that avoids the reactive scenario that you can.
Neil, in the power sector, how much more carbon reductions do you think will occur under sort of the scenario that you just outlined? I look, we've made this transition from coal to natural gas. We've seen price declines in wind and solar. Now we're seeing challenges with building new transmission and scaling some of these things. Do you think the trend we've seen on decarbonization is going to continue, or do you think it will accelerate or level out? What's your
I think it'll continue. And I think, I'm hesitant to put a projection on it, because look, I look at things like when Waxman-Markey was proposed, what the projected emissions reductions were going to be if that legislation had been successfully enacted. It never moved forward, and yet we've blown past the projected emissions reductions in that legislation because of technology, because of innovation, because of cleaner sources of energy being deployed. And so I'm loath to make predictions on what the levels will be, because we don't know. And I'm again, having seen successful market-driven efforts to squeeze carbon out work already to date, I'm going to continue to be optimistic that we will see those benefits into the future. And I do apologize, I have to hop off.
Thank you. It's good to see you. Always interesting. Brandon, any thoughts on long-term economic outlook and sort of the things that are in play in reconciliation this year?
I guess one thing I would note is the global context for carbon pricing, and that US companies are getting more and more exposure to carbon pricing. As of now, there's around the world, there's 47 national and 36 subnational carbon pricing regimes. They cover almost a quarter of all global emissions. There's more and more kind of opportunities for US companies to kind of have exposure to this. One of the kind of the more interesting developments is in Europe with their emissions trading scheme. They're implementing CBAM, basically border adjustments for their cap and trade system. And one interesting thing there is, while CBAM is still under kind of design development, is that if products imported into Europe or into the EU ETS zone are already taxed for the carbon price, they aren't subject to the border adjustments. Again, it's under design, but it would be interesting from a kind of an action forcing event, because if the US, say, had no carbon price, was exporting goods to Europe, the border adjustments would hit them. US implemented the carbon price, same exact tax, but the US gets the revenue instead of Europe. And so it's not really a tax increase from the business perspective, it's just shifting revenue from the European Union to the US. Yeah. And so these border adjustments might be an action forcing event for policy in the future.
And I know Maya paid a lot about attention to that, because I'm sure she worries about fiscal conditions of our European trading partners, but her principal interest is our fiscal conditions. I've been so interested, I've sort of taken over and asked a bunch of questions, and we haven't gotten to many questions from the audience, but we're running out of time. Maya, do you have any closing thoughts? You started off optimistically saying you thought there was a greater than 50% chance, and then you sort of were very pessimistic there at the end. And I, of course, am sitting here, the year Social Security goes insolvent is the year I plan to file for Social Security benefits. So when you said that wasn't a forcing function, I reached over to my retirement Vanguard thing and put a star on it. I'm going to have to make an adjustment there. Closing thoughts. This is a remarkable moment that deficit reduction has become an important consideration in reconciliation, because you mentioned it hasn't even been an important consideration in debt limit increases in the past. Is this just a one-time Joe Manchin phenomena, or do you think we're at this moment where deficits are beginning to matter regardless of party? And so in the future, like, do you see a deficit related deal related to the debt limit next year? I know that's your hope, but do you actually see it happening? And any other thoughts you have about climate as a driver for fiscal policy?
Sure. On the deficit front, I am more optimistic about this moment with reconciliation because we're so far along. And if you look at the zone of possible agreement, the overlap, it's there. There's a deal that could be done. I mean, you can see it down to the details right at this point, if they just are able to take the win. And because it is not complicated by the highly partisan environment, because they have reconciliation as a tool, it would be foolish not to let it go. be done. And so that's why I'm optimistic now, but pessimistic about once we get to divided government. Though I think that policies are much better if they're done in a bipartisan way. I'm a political independent, so I tend to like them more. And I think they're durable. And I think we really struggle with the lack of durability in our policies these days, where you do the ACA or you do the tax cuts and then the other party tries to repeal them, and that's the entire agenda. However, I think this may be a tipping point on the fiscal issues. About a decade ago, Simpson-Bowles made this issue incredibly hot. There was a blueprint for success. They came incredibly close to getting it done. Once they failed, everybody had deficit fatigue. It disappeared. All sorts of nonsense about, don't worry, you can borrow when times are good, when times are bad, it never has a problem, popped up, and politicians want to believe that. And so they do, whether it's on the right or the left. However, the environment now is making it impossible to tell those nonsensical stories, right? Inflation is here, and it is a reminder that there are choices that have to be made and trade-offs that have to be dealt with. I think Manchin was the tipping point that said, I'm going to insist that we talk about deficits. And frankly, there are a lot of people who want to, but if the political environment doesn't force it, it's a lot easier not to. And voters tend to ask for spending increases and tax cuts unless they're reminded of how that damages the economy and their families and certainly their future. So I think the Manchin putting it on the agenda, the environment of inflation, reminding us that the rules of macroeconomics actually still do exist, and the fact that underlying this, there is a lot of support on both the left and the right, maybe not as much as there needs to be for doing the really hard pieces that will fix this, but understanding the importance of the issue means we've got a better shot now than we did in the past half decade, where the issue was kind of dormant. And so I think it is the question of how do you take advantage of this, looking at those action forcing moments. The debt ceiling done responsibly is one of them, and build any kind of bipartisan support for any issues that raise revenue, which, by the way, in and of themselves can be good policy. The beautiful thing about a carbon tax is that it raises revenue and achieves the policies you want. That is a twofer that should not be ignored. So I think looking for those kinds of opportunities increase the likelihood that the action forcing moments are handled in a good and positive way.
Yeah, it's interesting how you talk about the life cycle of Simpson-Bowles and how it's been a decade since we had that moment, because it makes me reflect back that climate had Waxman-Markey over a decade ago, and you do get these fatigue that lasts a long period of time. So if you get close and you don't succeed, you really can be out and wandering in the wilderness for a long time. Brandon, any final comments from you as we get close to the hour?
The only last thing I would say, I've had some more optimistic comments on carbon pricing throughout this. Maybe I'll throw in one pessimistic comment just to fit in. I would note that when you look at projections of U.S. emissions, there is the trend of more carbon efficiency, say less emissions per unit of energy, something along those lines. But there's also a growing economy, which just as the economy grows and emits more. And under a business as usual scenario, you can kind of think of that as more or less a current law scenario. US emissions are more or less flat. They're not going down, they're not going up. They're more or less flat if you look at EIA projections or IEA projections. And so without actually doing something, at least the current experts who are forecasting don't think the market will just do it by itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I can't let you at all end on that amount of pessimism. I will say, because my outlook is even more pessimistic, I'm quite worried that if the Fed, to the extent we fail to act in the near term, the reality of climate change causes us to fight over the consequences even more and more. So we start dealing with flood insurance reform and having to do adaptation and other things, and it actually gets more difficult than just putting together a responsible mitigation strategy. So, my optimism is by necessity, because I'm worried it gets harder rather than easier over time. I want to thank both of you, and for Neil for joining us this morning, for everybody who participated. I learned something, and that's a good day in Washington, when we have the opportunity to listen to people who really do understand how the system works and what the opportunities were. So thank you both. I'm grateful for everybody who joined us today. Thank you, Meredith, for organizing this. Brandon and Maya, thank you. We really appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks, Alex. Bye.